Thank you, gentlemen. That was awesome. We're going to continue the trend of new technologies. And this topic is also passionate to me. It's making the cloud work on-prem. I'm really curious about this topic because on-prem and cloud aren't the same thing. So Claudia Souza, very good friend of mine, she's going to moderate this panel. Claudia, do you remember when you and I had this conversation about, okay, I have this edit room that's running, I don't know, OBS or whatever, and we were trying to talk about why did it make sense for me to transition that room to cloud? So I'm really curious about how this panel covers that topic, so enjoy.
Feels like years ago.
It was.
All right, everyone. So right now what I want to talk about a little bit is we all transitioned to cloud only, remote only because of COVID, and everybody had to be kind of scrappy, and put everything together in a hurry. But as we did that, things that were not a typical part of a production became acceptable. And nowadays, maybe even something we expect to utilize going forward. So as you look at going back on-prem, putting together these hybrid workflows that include cloud and on-prem, where have your values changed of what's important to keep from the cloud and what is important to incorporate into your on-prem world now?
I can grab, I'll go. So first and foremost, before I say anything, I just want to thank Marty and the people at SVG for putting on just an awesome event. It's great to see a great crowd here. And thank you everybody at SVG for making this possible. So, you know, I think that what we've really done as an industry here is we have been scrappy. I think that's a really good word. And we've had to do what we needed to do to create outcomes. But now we're starting to think about the pendulum moving a little bit back and finding its level. And so this notion of cloud, this notion of prem, we're starting to really drive into the hybrid to cloud model. So what are best practices that we as an industry can adopt on cloud? What's the industry best practices on-prem? And so what we really see at Videon is how do we start to use the prem devices to connect and be a holistic extension of the cloud where you can start to do things that really need to happen from a timing perspective, from a cost perspective, from an integration perspective, but do it in a way that it feels very much an extension of the cloud. What makes that possible? Things like what Josh just talked about with 5G. What makes that possible? Taking microservices down to on-prem, but really connecting these two worlds. So we see it as a hybridization as far as the water finding level.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say from Accenture's perspective, we went remote. We didn't go cloud when the pandemic hit, but we went remote very fast in a matter of weeks. And we've retained all of that technology. I think it's enabled our thought process in cloud today. But we didn't go cloud during the pandemic, but we did go remote productions, and we enabled 100 producers, TDs, engineers. We enabled them in their homes, so we extended all of our production control room facilities into their homes, and we've retained it all because the technology works very well, but also because I don't think many of our employees wanted to come back to the office. So much of that is still there today, and then what that has enabled us to do is hybrid cloud, which is build a cloud environment in our facility. So this is our stepping stone into a full, virtual cloud production environment. But much of the interoperability in cloud doesn't exist today, and it's still being worked out. But we can run that on-prem in cloud, and that's our first step into it. So we've retained all of it, and then we've continued to advance through it, even though the pandemic has released us from having to be, permanently remote.
I think from a software vendor perspective, it's listening to customers and preparing as an organization to service both. Our software can be run on-prem, but your licenses can be flexible and you can move them to cloud. And even from a licensing standpoint, we were talking earlier today, and some of the dependencies on your local on-prem footprint and the amount of content being done today. Your studios you only have a finite space, and in certain times of the season or the year, you may need to turn on and build 2 cloud control rooms, and that may take place for a 30-day time period, and then you shut it off, and you may not go back to it for another few months. So there's flexibility in that, and from a software vendor perspective, the licensing can be flexible in that same way. Use it on-prem when you need to, move it up to the cloud when you have to, and then bring it back down after you're done.
Yeah, I think from NBCUniversal perspective, you know, or I'll mention what I was doing previously, which was events for a large Silicon Valley company, and just the same way as when the pandemic hit, people were more comfortable with, for instance, pets being on screen and kids running around and whatever. There was a lot of that same sort of flexibility in the production complexity, right? So we no longer felt like we had to have all the, you know, all the tricks in the bag to have a production. The most important thing was getting that information across to the employees in the company. And I think that that's pretty similar when you are thinking about a news organization. You know, NBCUniversal local division that I work for, our job is to get really important information to the public. And so, you know, that's kind of how our values have shifted as we've started using some of these remote production tools, is valuing the ability to get that important content to people in an effective and pleasing way, visually pleasing way, and you know, rather than the complexity, being able to scale, because there's also a much greater demand for media now than there was before the pandemic. Just like, you know, social media and web content and everything has really just blown up. So it's really like we have a lot more content to make and a lot more content to distribute. So making the production of that content more streamlined and agile and scalable and flexible really helps us accomplish that.
Absolutely. And do you find that there's a lot more flexibility and openness right now to different ways of doing things? For instance, in my 30 years in broadcast, never would we have accepted video conferencing contribution or half of what is now put on air as final content because we were so rigid in the way we looked at things. Since the pandemic, have you found that the companies you work with or for are a lot more open and flexible to tools that are used and what is acceptable content?
Yeah, I'll jump right in on that one because one of the things we, in the long-range planning meeting that we had at the end of last year, one of the two of the key points that I raised was we're not that special and we have a lot of baggage and like in the broadcast industry, you know, like there's a lot of people making content across the world right now from cell phones and from, you know, OBS and all these like, you know, consumer level devices where their content looks like arguably equal to a lot of what's out there on major news networks and TV stations. And it's like, why do we have to have this whole huge infrastructure to make the same thing? So we're like, and you know, we're at Silicon Valley Video Summit, you know, Silicon Valley has been using these tools that we're kind of now discovering as an industry for a long time. Cloud-based tools, containerization of workflows, easy ways to scale. Those are things that we're now learning, and being able to be really flexible and adapt, and yeah, have, you know, no, this show actually doesn't, this is a breaking news event. We don't need to have 3D motion graphics for this. Like, just, you know, get the video content on air. Yeah, they can use live view on their phone. iPhone camera's great. Like, it'll work for, you know, making sure that people know this news now. So there's a lot of that.
Yeah, I'll extend off of this because what I'll never forget is I was at IBC at a Devoncroft event just before COVID hit. And at that Devoncroft event, there was a technologist from PBS that said, ladies and gentlemen, we need to look at video as a supply chain. And why are we doing what we have done considering what the video is that we're starting to deliver? We need to break this down and start to break down the barriers to create cost outcomes proportional to what the viewing outcomes are. And then what happened? We go into COVID, and now democratization of video, everything available, all sorts of things where people can say, I want what I want, when I want it, how I want it, and deliver it whenever I want it. And so what it's forcing us as an industry to think about is, how are we going to rethink that supply chain? How are we going to use best practices of cloud? How are we going to use best practices of the CDN? How are we going to use best practices of on-prem? How are we going to connect this holistically so that we can create scale, personalization, engagement outcomes that drive real results? And so this is what's before us. And the great news is that there are all the companies that are here on this panel and you out there that we're all trying to think about this. And as we as a collective come together to address, we are going to enable. And that's very exciting for an event like this to bring us all together.
I could talk to, speak on pre-COVID, the need of content was, and the access to, contributors was ramping up. In my former job, it was, how do we get, fans of a sport to come on air? Normally, if we had a reporter, analyst, someone from the organization, they'd get a $10,000 kit with a, PTZ camera and interface and everything installed in their home with a fiber, this and that. We're not going to do that for everyday, 5-day-a-week fan, shows for fan engagement. So we started using, infrastructures like Skype, and what you're talking about with teleconferencing, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, things that we're doing now, we're starting to be used pre-pandemic, but then the pandemic caused us to use that every day. And that's the access point. And we found out quickly that the industry didn't care necessarily about quality as it did content. How many people, how many faces can we get on to talk about this? And people, or consumers, understood that, well, she's on her laptop. I just saw her cat walk past, but what's important is the content that we're talking about. And then the broadcasters were able to sit and say, well, now let's invest. Maybe we don't like this picture because it is soft. Let's invest and get them a nicer looking camera. Let's give them a higher quality microphone than their laptop, right? And then the quality of that picture became nicer to a suitable standard to a broadcaster. And I think that's something coming out of the pandemic that we're going to see, because now we have so much contribution, so much content that needs to be covered. You have to have that reach. If something happens, especially for a news organization, you have to reach a reporter in another country even. That is instantly able to be done today with video conferencing software. And I think that's something that we'll see grow even more, and we'll see the quality of those services become even more demanding in our everyday broadcasts.
One thing that I found very interesting, I worked for the big manufacturers in the broadcast industry for most of my career, and mostly with broadcast customers. But even 10 years ago, I started working with, and please forgive the term if nobody here likes it, new media, but we had to call it something, so we started calling new media. We started calling the esports companies. And what I found is they were a lot more open to doing things differently. Whereas all my broadcast customers, it had worked for them for decades, and why not continue that way? So when the pandemic hit, the customers in here, the new media, the Silicon Valley, the esports, for them, I felt that it wasn't as hard of a transition because they're already used to doing things differently with different tools, kind of a bigger tool belt that was more than just the big manufacturers that I worked for. And so it's really neat to see that the rest of broadcast, in hiring you, Maurissa, it's looked and said, you know what, these guys were really ahead of the curve. They were doing things differently than we were. So there's something to learn from this group. And it's, to me, exciting to see kind of all those groups coming together and really one helping the other so that we can continue to innovate. One of the things that I'm curious about as you guys are looking into the future, both of where you came from and this whole bringing the cloud back to on-prem, as we're designing these new places that take into account the on-prem facilities with what can we leverage in the cloud, Was there anything that you or your customers ran into that was unexpected? You know, everybody says, yeah, latency and things that are but were there some things that surprised you as challenges to overcome in this world?
I'll jump on that one. What shocked me was something as simple as timing. Timing became really, really, really complex. So in a fully remote world, how do you get deterministic timing? How do those multiple cameras have common time sync? How do you have local triggering? How do you do that from remote? And so it shocked me that timing was that hard. And so that's one where it's, again, this water finding a level that maybe we need to do some best practices on-prem to complement the critical things that we do in cloud so that we create better outcomes. But timing shocked me.
I mean, I would also say that, we're all going to talk about security, and anybody that's put a cloud environment in the broadcast environments today is frustrated by security. We're frustrated by it. We frustrate our suppliers by it, and we struggle with it, and it adds to our timelines. But I think the only way to look at it from the security standpoint is you got to have it in your initial design. So if you take a lesson from the IT folks that have been building secured systems, that have been maintaining our companies for years, and we're putting video applications and production applications in that same infrastructure, they run a process called P by D, which is protection by design, and have that in your design going up front, and your system will go in a lot smoother. One thing that surprised us was that video is full of PII, and PII is highly protected. And we have to run those same types of protection systems and content management systems based on data that is protecting PII, because that's what video is. And that's prevalent in the enterprise video, not so much in the broadcast world, but in enterprise, PII has to be protected. Our systems have to protect it, and our cloud environments have to be designed to protect it as well.
I would say one thing that surprised me the most was maybe the lack of investment in education. The flexibility of a broadcaster to look into other software tools to do the same job, right? Whether it's graphics being done traditionally or with HTML5. Is it video switching being done legacy or with software solutions, right? What really shocked me was the industry wanted to continue on with the same companies and brands that they knew, and the lack of coming over and looking at all of these different new solutions that were working, and the expectation of everything needing to be at a certain high operational level, even if those operational levels weren't needed for that content. I think that we're learning as an industry that there's more tools being built every day by so many different vendors. And not every production needs a full-fledged graphics rendering engine. And something like HTML5 could be very powerful for them. With everything that's happening with an event and the alternate feed of broadcasts as well, to supplement those alternate feeds, whether it be different language graphics or just a different type of stats or topic on the same type of event, these alternate softwares and solutions are aiding in that that event and the content. So I was rather shocked on the resistance, but I think that people are businesses and broadcasters are coming along to learning and having their operators learn these new tools.
Yeah, I mean, adding on to that a little bit, there's a lot of stuff out there from non-traditional vendors that's coming up that broadcasters are definitely needing to be more open-minded about. Instead of just assuming, let's do this because we've always done it that way, let's use this tool because we know they're solid. There's those sorts of assumptions about major vendors are starting to break down a little bit, and we are starting to look at newer solutions. And yes, HTML5 graphics is a great example. There's players coming up in that industry where it's yeah, that actually does most of what we need. Yeah, cool, thanks. That's way simpler. Cool. So it is really interesting to see what people are coming up with. Surprising. I think what's surprising is how much you have to know about how stuff works in order to implement it. From a security perspective and from an architecture perspective, it's no longer like, oh, here's this black box that does magical video stuff. I'm going to take the SDI out of it. Like, cool, done. Or, I'm going to configure it through this software GUI. It's like, actually, I need to know what type of computer chips are inside your box and how they're wired together to the different NICs. And I need to know all that level of detail because that's how you choose which resources to deploy this stuff on in cloud. You need to know all those nitty-gritty details, and cyber needs to know that. And there's a lot of detail, which I don't know if that's honestly going to persist in the way that it is now, because I think eventually media vendors things will move more towards a SaaS model. And if they're not, the vendors will be very confident in what needs to happen from the cloud side and have that all very thoroughly documented, or at least I hope so. This is my dream, right? Like, if, any vendors, if you want to just like give really clear drawings of how your stuff works, and so we can just bypass me and hand it to cyber, that'd be great. But
Noted.
What?
I said noted.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Definitely working with cyber was a surprise to me of just how challenging it was going to be. You get through all the technology challenges of making things work, and in the beginning, you then experience the challenge of cyber. Now I think we're starting very early on and having somebody from cyber on the team from day one as you're designing the workflows to make sure that you're not hitting a roadblock 90% of the way there. Thank you, my audio person. Now, what was I just thinking? Okay, lessons learned here. You guys have been doing this for quite a while now, and not everybody here has. So as you're looking back on everything you've learned, what would you have as advice for people just starting out, especially in that hybrid world, trying to make the cloud work on-prem? What goes on-prem? What goes in the cloud? How do you stay flexible enough? Because it's not just let's build something that works in this exact hybrid environment. Today it's hybrid, but now I'm building something that works in today's hybrid, and tomorrow you can flip a switch and have it be totally remote if we all have to go back and shelter at home. So what have you learned that you think is an important thing to keep in mind as we're starting to build those for anyone here?
So one of the things I think has to become just a definitive best practice is you cannot have standalone devices in the workflow. Everything has to be monitored, managed, controlled from a single point of glass in cloud. And so as devices start to show up that are bespoke, as devices no longer are part of that chain, immediately that creates a problem for us. So we as vendors, we as suppliers, we as integrators must make sure that all of the pieces are seeable from the cloud as a single workflow. To me, that's a best practice that has to be adopted going forward.
So interoperability testing, I think that's another huge one. The pace of innovation by new manufacturers, but even by some of the traditional manufacturers, the pace of innovation, the new products that are coming out, there are so many products that can do things. So that interoperability testing and making sure everything works together is becoming critical. And unlike the old days, even with 2110 and Fox Woodlands doing all these great interoperability testings, this is something that we're trying to take on ourselves at ASG, because there hasn't been a forum so far to do these massive testings of all the products, and even keeping up with as many products as we want to test out on a regular basis is a full-time job.
I would say two things. One, build your platform first. So don't assume that you can jump in and be like, I'm going to put a video switcher and an audio mixer and, do some routing. And stuff. Like that, you've already just shot yourself in the foot, because you're going to have to figure out where that stuff is built and, what architecture it's going to lay upon, or else it's going to be a big mess down the line. So definitely start with your platform. And the other thing is live documentation. Document everything, and if you can automate everything, Yes, make it all, programmatically deployed, and having programmatic documentation too. So for instance, when you start deploying your tooling with automation tools like Terraform, Ansible, Puppet, all those sorts of things, your systems are getting documented in real time, right? Because you have that backlog and that code to reference. Similarly, even manually documented things, making sure that's live and agile, and so that way, at any given moment, someone can look and say, what's actually going on? Whether someone went in and updated that spreadsheet or not, you actually know what the state of the system is. So real-time monitoring and real-time documentation. Whether you can solve that through automation, if you can, great. If you can't, then just really operationally, you got to be on top of documenting things.
Great.
The one thing I would say also about this is that, make sure you have the talent on your team. These are not servers if you're on-prem or if you're off-prem. These are not servers that you're putting in production. These are highly complex compute environments that have very specialized networking and control systems around them. So if you don't have a good cloud architect on your team, you should have one. And then you should have a lot of experience on the team that has done this type of complex cloud development and environment controls and management. Yep.
I would say involve IT immediately, probably prep them before the initial call, and the earlier the better, because I've witnessed so many scenarios where you're halfway down the road and then IT comes in and says, full stop. So the conversation, and having them in that conversation very early is so important.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's one that's bit all of us in everywhere, whether it was in a previous role, in this role, that always happens, so agreed. So we only have a few minutes left, but I do want to ask, looking forward, what are we going to be sitting here on this stage a year from now talking about? What are you most excited about? What do you see coming around the corner, technology-wise, that really excites you, that's going to help us move forward with these hybrid workflows?
I am so excited about when the NVIDIA technology that was being shown in the last panel and the opportunity to deploy machine learning at the point video originates produces metadata that we can never imagine what we're going to do with. I think that in a year or two, the metadata could be as important and interesting as the video itself.
Elasticity. Lots of folks are that are not in the video business are going to cloud specifically to save money. And all of our management wants us to save money, and they expect us to save money. And the fact that most of the production tools that are existing in the cloud are going in cloud today are VM-based, and they're not container-based, and they're not elastic yet, and they're not automated for when you need that capacity. We've been hearing about capacity flexibility for years, and I'm hoping in the next year or so that there's more containership and automation and elasticity in these environments.
The ability to deploy instantly. A year from today, I hope that broadcasters or content creators alike can deploy their content in cloud when they need it, shut it off, destroy it, whatever they need to do, move it over to a different service if need be, or into a private VM. But the whole process of building a structure to create that content, make it be deployable easy. And that starts with the development and all the research all of these companies are doing today.
Yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with kind of what you all are saying, is basically make things more cloud native. And that's not just because we want to put our stuff in public cloud, because we like AWS. It's because it helps us, which we do, then thank you, AWS. Because we want to be able to utilize those tools more efficiently, right? So there's a lot that putting things in the cloud offers, but unless the tools that you're putting there really fully take advantage of all of that, there's not really a good point in doing it, right? So you have to have tools where you can extract some of that data to make it useful for you, for analytics. You have to be able to make things scalable and elastic and programmatically deployable, which is basically what you were saying. So the ability to say, hey, that's really like, again, a message for all the vendors out there. If you can make your tools easily programmatically deployable, whether they still have to be monolithic, okay, I'm excited for when they're scalable, but even if they are monolithic, like let us go in there and programmatically deploy how many of them, where it's located and all that stuff, and make that easy. Give us easy hooks to be able to do that, and we're going to be much more happy to use your software.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and unified orchestration, monitoring, and control, and that's for all of us. That's the next thing to make all of this a reality. So thank you so much, panel. It's been really wonderful moderating this, and thanks for everybody for being here.